The morning sun over Boston was not a gentle awakening, it was a revelation. It pierced through the immense, floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the Vane Institute of Art, slashing across the polished travertine floors in bars of blinding white and gold. It was 8 a.m. on a Tuesday, an hour when the museum was a cathedral of silence, void of the tourists and the whispering students. Here, the air was climate-controlled to a precise 68 degrees, smelling faintly of lemon polish, old canvas, and the terrifying weight of history. For Abigail, this silence was the only time she felt she truly belonged. At 26, Abigail was technically a junior conservation assistant, a title that sounded important but mostly meant she spent her days in the windowless basement, mixing solvents and cataloging frames. She didn't have the Ivy League pedigree or the European internships that her colleagues boasted about. She had a scholarship degree from a state college, a mountain of student loans, and hands that possessed a supernatural steadiness. She was the invisible mechanic of the art world, the one who cleaned the grime off the halos of saints so the donors could admire the shine. She stood on a stepped ladder in the grand gallery, her hands encased in white cotton gloves. She was inspecting the frame of a 19th-century portrait that had arrived from Vienna the night before. The varnish was cracking, a spiderweb of age that threatened to obscure the subject's eyes. Abigail leaned in close, dangerously close, her breath held tight in her chest. She wasn't just looking at paint, she was looking at the soul trapped beneath the layers of oil. We protect the masterpiece behind glass, forgetting that art was meant to be felt, not just seen. She was humming. It was a soft, unconscious melody, a habit she had picked up to fill the empty spaces of her solitary life. She didn't realize how loud it sounded in the cavernous, echoing gallery. She didn't hear the heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall swing open. She didn't hear the rhythmic, authoritative click of Italian leather shoes approaching across the stone floor. Nathaniel Vane stopped 10 feet away from the ladder. He was the director of the Institute, a man whose last name was chiseled into the stone archway above the entrance. At 34, Nathaniel was not the brooding, damaged air of a Gothic novel. He was a man of absolute precision. He wore a charcoal 3-piece suit that fit him with architectural perfection. His hair was dark, combed back severely, revealing a face that was handsome in a sharp, intellectual way, high cheekbones, a jawline that suggested stubbornness, and eyes of a piercing, icy blue that missed nothing. He was not a man who tolerated chaos, and a humming assistant hovering inches from a priceless artifact was chaos. "You are breathing on the pigment," Nathaniel said. His voice was deep, calm, and cut through the air like a scalpel. Abigail gasped. The sudden sound shattered her concentration. She jerked back, her foot slipping on the step-ladder. She flailed for a second, a terrifying moment of weightlessness, before she caught her balance on the top rail. She looked down. Nathaniel Vane stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, watching her with an expression that wasn't angry, but intensely critical. He looked like a statue that had decided to judge the living. I apologize, Director Vane," Abigail stammered, climbing down the ladder with trembling legs. She smoothed her white lab coat, conscious of a smudge of charcoal on her sleeve. "I was inspecting the micro-fissures in the varnish. The humidity in the crate was higher than the manifest stated." Nathaniel stepped closer. He didn't look at her face. He looked past her, up at the painting. He scrutinized it for a long, agonizing minute. Abigail held her breath. She felt small, exposed, a fraud standing before the high priest of the temple. "The manifest was correct," Nathaniel said, his eyes still on the canvas. "The crate was sealed in Vienna under my supervision." "With respect, sir," Abigail said, the words slipping out before her fear could stop them. "The wood has expanded. Look at the lower left corner. The tension is pulling the canvas. If we hang it under these lights without stabilizing it, the paint will flake within a week." Nathaniel slowly lowered his gaze from the art to the woman. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the messy bun held together by a pencil, the cheap fabric of her trousers, and the nervous wringing of her gloved hands. But he also saw her eyes, brown, warm, and defiant. She was challenging his assessment. No one challenged Nathaniel Vane inside these walls. He walked past her, stepping up to the painting. He leaned in, squinting at the corner she had indicated. He stayed there for a long time. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, he stepped back. He turned to face her. "You are the new assistant from the basement," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Abigail." "Yes, sir." "You are correct," Nathaniel said. The admission was clipped, devoid of warmth. "The tension is too high. I will have the head conservator address it." "I can address it," Abigail volunteered, a spark of hope lighting her chest. "I know the solvent mixture. I've studied this artist's technique." Nathaniel looked at her, his blue eyes cooling instantly. He stepped into her personal space, creating a boundary with his very presence. He was close enough that she could smell him, crisp paper, sandalwood, and cold air. "This is a $5 million acquisition, Abigail," he said softly. "We do not let junior assistants practice on masterpieces. You have a good eye, but do not mistake vision for authority." He adjusted his cuffs, his demeanor shifting back to the impenetrable director. "And Abigail." "Yes, sir." "When you are in the galleries, please refrain from humming. It is distracting. We maintain a standard of absolute professionalism here. The art demands reverence, not familiarity." He held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, a strange tension vibrating in the air between them. Then he turned on his heel and walked away. Abigail stood alone in the sun-drenched gallery, realizing that the most beautiful thing in the museum wasn't the painting on the wall, but the terrifyingly cold man who had just forbidden her from being human. The basement of the Vane Institute was a world away from the sun-drenched galleries above. Here, there was no travertine marble, only poured concrete and the humming fluorescent lights that turned skin a pale, ghostly shade. It was a kingdom of solvents, linen, and magnifying lenses, a place where art was not worshipped but dissected. For the next 2 weeks, Abigail existed in this subterranean quiet. She told herself that the encounter in the gallery had been a fluke, a momentary lapse in the rigid stratification of the museum's hierarchy. Nathaniel Vane was a man who lived in the penthouse of the world. She was the woman who swept the basement. But the memory of his blue eyes, critical, cold, yet terrifyingly attentive, lingered in her mind like the after-image of a flashbulb. She was working late on a Thursday, restoring a gold leaf frame that had been damaged by water decades ago. The museum was officially closed. The silence of the building was heavy, pressing down through the floorboards above. Then the elevator dinged. The sound was shockingly loud in the quiet lab. Abigail froze, her brush hovering over a flake of gold. The heavy metal doors slid open, and Nathaniel walked out. He looked out of place in the basement. His tailored navy suit seemed too sharp for the cluttered tables, his polished shoes too pristine for the concrete floor. He didn't look lost. He looked like a man seeking refuge. "Director Vane," Abigail said, setting down her brush, her heart performing a traitorous leap against her ribs. "I thought everyone had gone home." Nathaniel replied, stepping into the room, "The gala is in 3 days. Silence is a luxury I cannot afford upstairs right now. The event planners are testing the acoustics." He stopped at her table. He was close enough that the scent of him, cool air and expensive soap, overpowered the smell of turpentine. "You are working on the Medici frame," he noted, looking down at her hands. "Show me," he commanded softly. It wasn't a challenge this time. It was a request. Abigail picked up her brush. She leaned over the frame, conscious of him standing just inches from her shoulder. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, a physical presence that made the air feel thin. With a steady hand, She applied a microscopic dot of adhesive, sealing the fracture without altering the history of the piece. Nathaniel watched. He didn't look at the gold. He looked at her hands. He watched the way her fingers moved with a grace that defied the roughness of her surroundings. "You have a surgeon's hands," Nathaniel murmured. The praise was quiet, almost involuntary. Abigail looked up, startled. Their faces were dangerously close. She saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the subtle cracks in the perfect porcelain of his persona. "And you have a critic's eyes," she countered bravely. "You look for the flaw before you look for the beauty." Nathaniel didn't pull away. He held her gaze, the blue ice of his irises thawing just enough to reveal a deep, restless ocean beneath. "It is my job to find the flaw, Abigail. If I don't see it, the world will. And the Vane legacy does not tolerate imperfection." "Perfection is static, sir," Abigail whispered. "Art is alive because it breaks, because it ages. You're trying to freeze time, but I'm just trying to help the pieces survive it." The tension in the room shifted. It changed from professional scrutiny to something darker, heavier. Nathaniel looked at her mouth, then back to her eyes. He seemed to be fighting a war within himself, a battle between the rigid geometry of his life and the chaotic, organic pull he felt toward this woman. He reached out. His hand hovered near the frame, near her hand. For a split second, Abigail thought he might touch her. The air crackled with the electricity of the almost. "The gala," Nathaniel said abruptly, pulling his hand back and straightening his spine. The wall was back up. The moment was severed. "We are displaying the Vienna portrait. I want you to oversee the final hanging. Personally." "Me?" Abigail blinked, the whiplash of his tone leaving her dizzy. "Sir, the head conservator usually handles—" Nathaniel interrupted her, his voice sharp. "My head conservator dismissed the tension in the canvas as mere settling wood. He is arrogant, and frankly, he is wrong. You saw the danger when he only saw the insurance value. I need that kind of ruthless precision on Saturday night. You will be there. Not as a guest, of course. As technical support. Not as a guest." The distinction landed like a stone. He was inviting her into his world, but only to hold the door open. He was acknowledging her value, but only as a tool to maintain his perfection. "Of course, Director," Abigail said, her voice turning cool. "I will be there." Nathaniel nodded once. He looked like he wanted to say something else, something that wasn't about frames or galas or duty. But Nathaniel Vane was a man of discipline. "Good night, Abigail," he said. He turned and walked back to the elevator. As the doors closed, cutting off the sight of him, Abigail let out a shaky breath. She looked down at the gold on her hands. He had come down to the darkness to find her, but in the end he had retreated to the light, leaving her exactly where she was supposed to be. In the shadows. Saturday night arrived, transforming the Vane Institute from a sanctuary of silence into a cacophony of wealth. The grand gallery was unrecognizable. The austere stone floors were covered in plush velvet runners, and the air, usually smelling of old varnish, was now choked with the scent of expensive lilies and even more expensive perfume. 300 of the city's elite had gathered to worship at the altar of Nathaniel Vane's legacy. Abigail stood in the shadows of a recessed alcove near the Vienna portrait. She was dressed in black, a simple, severe dress that allowed her to vanish against the dark curtains. She wasn't a guest. She was a failsafe. Her job was to monitor the humidity sensors hidden behind the frame, ensuring the heat from the bodies didn't warp the wood she had so carefully stabilized. She watched the crowd with a detached, aching heart. They moved like a single, glittering organism, sipping champagne and laughing with mouths that never quite touched their eyes. And in the center of the orbit stood Nathaniel. He looked devastating. In a tuxedo, he was no longer the man who had leaned close to her in the basement. He was the director. He moved through the room with a predatory grace, charming donors, accepting accolades, and smiling that practiced, porcelain smile that Abigail now knew was a shield. He was a masterpiece on display, and he knew exactly how to catch the light. We stand on opposite sides of a glass, forgetting that the reflection we see is not the person on the other side. For 2 hours, he didn't look at her. He walked past her alcove 3 times, his gaze sliding over her as if she were part of the architecture, a pillar, a vent, a shadow. Abigail told herself it was necessary, but the memory of his voice in the dark lab, the way he had praised her hands, burned in her chest like a fever. Then the orbit shifted. During a lull in the speeches, Nathaniel broke away from a circle of board members. He didn't head for the bar. He walked straight toward the Vienna portrait. Toward her. Abigail's breath hitched. She checked the sensor reading on her tablet, pretending to be busy, but her hands were trembling. "The humidity is rising," Nathaniel said, stopping beside her. He didn't look at her, he looked at the painting. But his voice was low, intimate. "Is the stabilization holding?" "It's holding, Director," Abigail whispered, not daring to look up. "But the crowd is too dense. The temperature has spiked 3 degrees. "I don't care about the temperature," Nathaniel murmured, stepping closer, his shoulder brushing against the fabric of her dress. The contact sent a shockwave through her. "I hate this. All of it. The noise. The pretense. I would rather be in the basement watching glue dry." Abigail looked up then. She saw the crack in the ice. His blue eyes were frantic, searching hers for an anchor in the storm he had invited. "Then why do you do it?" she asked softly. "Because the museum needs a face," he replied, his voice thick with a sudden, desperate honesty. "And I am the only Vane left to wear the mask." For a second, the gala faded. It was just the 2 of them. Nathaniel's hand twitched at his side, the impulse to reach for her fighting against the iron bars of his discipline. "Nathaniel!" The voice shattered the moment like a dropped glass. A woman approached them. She was tall, blonde, and draped in silver silk that looked like liquid money. This was Victoria Sterling. She placed a possessive hand on Nathaniel's arm, claiming him with the ease of someone who has never been told no. "You're hiding," Victoria teased, her eyes flickering to Abigail with cold, dismissive amusement. "And talking to the staff. Really, darling, you take your micromanagement too far." Nathaniel stiffened. The mask slammed back into place, instantaneous and brutal. He froze, caught between the truth of his heart and the lie of his life. "I was merely checking the structural integrity of the acquisition, Victoria," Nathaniel said. His voice was flat. "Professional. Dead." "Well, the acquisition is fine," Victoria laughed. "But my father is waiting. He heard rumors that you've been distracted lately, spending too much time downstairs." She looked pointedly at Abigail. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. Abigail looked at Nathaniel. She waited for him to defend her work. She waited for the man from the basement to step forward. But that man didn't come. Nathaniel looked at the donors, watching him from across the room. He looked at Victoria, and then he looked at Abigail. His eyes went cold. It was a protective coldness, but to Abigail it felt like a knife. "The staff are interchangeable, Victoria," Nathaniel said, his voice clear and loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "I assure you, my focus is entirely on the legacy. This is simply maintenance. Technical support. Nothing more. Technical support. Nothing more." The words hung in the air, sucking the oxygen out of Abigail's lungs. He hadn't just dismissed her, he had erased her. "Good." Victoria smiled, satisfied. "Then come along. Leave the girl to do her job." Nathaniel allowed himself to be led away. He didn't look back. Abigail looked down at her hands, the surgeon's hands he had praised. They felt numb. She placed the tablet on the floor. She turned and walked toward the service exit, moving through the crowd that didn't see her. She walked out of the heavy oak doors and into the cool Boston night, the sound of her own heart breaking louder than any applause inside. The separation was absolute. He had chosen the museum over the muse, and the silence between them was no longer a sanctuary, it was a tomb. Monday morning brought a gray, overcast sky to Boston, stripping the Vane Institute of its golden glamour and leaving it looking like what it truly was, a fortress of cold stone. The basement lab felt colder than usual. Abigail packed her small box of personal items, a mug, a spare sweater, a set of fine-point brushes she had bought with her own money. She moved with the efficient, non-mechanical motions of someone who has cauterized a wound to stop the bleeding. She didn't wait for HR. She didn't wait for an exit interview. She took the service elevator up to the top floor, the executive suite where the air was thin and the view was expensive. She walked past the assistant's empty desk and pushed open the heavy double doors to the director's office. Nathaniel was there. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city he claimed to own. He wasn't wearing his jacket. His tie was undone, hanging loosely around his neck like a noose he had forgotten to tighten. He held a glass of scotch, though it was barely 9 a.m. He didn't turn when she entered. He didn't have to. The tension in the room snapped tight, a violin string pulled to the breaking point. "I expected you sooner," Nathaniel said, his voice rough, lacking the polished cadence of the gala. "I'm not here to argue, Nathaniel," Abigail said, using his first name with a quiet defiance. She walked to his massive mahogany desk and placed her security badge on the polished surface. It made a sharp click that echoed in the cavernous room. "I'm here to resign. You said I was interchangeable. So replace me." Nathaniel turned slowly. His face was pale, the shadows under his eyes deep and bruised. He looked at the badge, then at her. He looked like a man who had been standing guard over a ruin for 1,000 years. "I didn't say that because it was true," he whispered. "I said it because it was necessary." Abigail's voice trembled with suppressed anger as she replied, "Necessary for whom? For Victoria Sterling? For your father's legacy? You humiliated me, Nathaniel. You looked me in the eye and erased me just to secure a check." "Yes," Nathaniel admitted. He didn't flinch. "I did. Because if I hadn't, there wouldn't be a museum for you to resign from." He walked over to the desk and slammed his glass down hard. The scotch splashed over the rim, staining the wood. "You think this is a kingdom, Abigail? You think I sit up here counting gold?" He laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. "The Vane Institute is bankrupt. It has been for 5 years. My father didn't leave me a legacy. He left me a corpse. I have been embalming it, painting over the rot, begging donors like Sterling just to keep the lights on for 1 more month. If Victoria's father had sensed even a moment of weakness, if he had seen me distracted by an assistant instead of focused on the endowment, he would have pulled the funding. And the doors would have closed forever." Abigail stared at him, the revelation hitting her with the force of a physical blow. The precision, the coldness, the obsession with perfection, it wasn't arrogance. It was panic. He wasn't a king. He was a desperate curator trying to keep a crumbling artifact from turning to dust. "You're protecting a lie," Abigail whispered. "I am protecting the art," Nathaniel shouted, finally losing his composure. "I am protecting the history. I sacrificed my pride, my sleep, and yes, I sacrificed you, to make sure those paintings don't end up in a private vault in Dubai where no one will ever see them again." He gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white, fighting to breathe. "I hid behind professionalism," he choked out, his voice cracking, "because I knew that if I let myself feel this, if I stopped being your boss for even 1 second, I wouldn't care about the legacy anymore. I'd let this whole damn museum go bankrupt just to keep you." The silence that followed was deafening. The truth hung in the air, raw and exposed. He hadn't rejected her because she wasn't enough. He had rejected her because she was the only thing that mattered more than the duty he was chained to. Abigail walked around the desk. She entered his space, not as a subordinate, but as the only person in the building who saw the man behind the director. "You're drowning, Nathaniel," she said softly. "You think you're holding up the roof, but you're just burying yourself." He looked at her with devastation. "I have no choice. I am a Vane. This is all I am." Abigail countered gently. "No. You are the man who sat in the basement and watched glue dry because you cared about the work. You are the man who saw the tension in the canvas. You are not this building." She reached out and took the glass from his hand, setting it aside. Then she took his hand. It was cold, trembling. His phone buzzed on the desk. The screen lit up, Victoria Sterling. The vibrations sounded like an alarm. It was the choice. The check, the safety, the lie, or the truth standing in front of him. Nathaniel looked at the phone. Then he looked at Abigail. "If I answer that," he said, "I save the museum. But I lose you." Abigail replied, her eyes clear and steady. "If you answer that, you lose yourself. You become just another artifact, Nathaniel. Frozen, perfect, and dead." Nathaniel closed his eyes. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He let go of the breath, and with it, the years of suffocating duty. He reached out and declined the call. He didn't just silence it. He turned the phone over. "I don't want to be perfect anymore," he whispered. He pulled her toward him. It wasn't a smooth, cinematic embrace. It was desperate and clumsy, the collision of two people who had been starving. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of turpentine and soap, holding on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was about to collapse. "Don't go," he pleaded against her skin. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to save it without the money. But I know I can't do it alone." Abigail wrapped her arms around him, feeling the tension in his shoulders finally, slowly begin to release. "We don't need to save the building, Nathaniel," she whispered into the quiet office. "We just need to save the art, and we can do that together." For the first time, the sun broke through the clouds outside, casting a single, imperfect beam of light across the floor. They stood in the center of the office, on the edge of ruin, but finally, they were standing in the light. The fall of the Vane Institute was not a quiet collapse. It was a symphony of headlines, gossip, and the sharp crack of an auctioneer's gavel. When Nathaniel declined the call from Victoria Sterling, he didn't just end a phone conversation, he dismantled a dynasty. The creditors descended like vultures within the week. The gala was canceled, the endowment withdrawn, and the great stone doors of the Institute were locked, the sign removed from the archway. To the society pages, it was a tragedy of mismanagement. To Nathaniel, it was the first deep breath he had taken in 10 years. But freedom has a cost. There was no trust fund left to catch him. The penthouse overlooking the harbor was sold to pay the severance for the staff. Nathaniel traded his vintage Aston Martin for the security deposit on a drafty lease in the South End and a fresh supply of pigments. On paper, it was financial ruin. In his heart, it was the only investment that had ever made sense. 6 months later, the Boston winter had thawed into a fragile, hopeful spring. The light that filtered through the windows of the small brick storefront was not the imposing, judgmental glare of the museum. It was warm, dusty, and unfiltered. The gold lettering on the glass door didn't say Institute. It read simply, Vane and Miller Conservation. Inside, the air smelled of turpentine, linseed oil, and coffee. It was a messy, chaotic space filled with half-restored canvases leaning against exposed brick walls. There was no temperature control system humming in the background, just the sound of a radio playing soft jazz and the scratch of a brush against canvas. Abigail sat at a workbench near the window, mixing a shade of cerulean blue. She looked up to watch the man working at the easel across the room. Nathaniel Vane was no longer wearing a charcoal 3-piece suit. He wore a canvas apron over a rolled-up shirt, his forearms stained with varnish and pigment. He was thinner, perhaps, stripped of the heavy armor of his inheritance, but the shadows under his eyes were gone. He was working on a landscape, a 17th century pastoral scene that a local collector had brought in. He wasn't directing. He wasn't managing. He was creating. He paused, holding the brush midair, his brow furrowed in that familiar look of intense scrutiny. But this time, when he looked at the flaw, he didn't look terrified. He looked patient. "The horizon line is tricky," Nathaniel murmured, more to the painting than to her. The original artist hesitated here. You can see the tremor in the brushstroke. Abigail walked over to stand beside him. She wiped her hands on a rag, resting her shoulder against his arm, a casual, intimate contact that still sent a warm thrill through her chest. "He was probably afraid," she said softly. "Maybe he knew he couldn't make it perfect." Nathaniel turned to look at her. His blue eyes, once so icy and remote, were now clear and open. He looked at the smudge of blue paint on her cheek. Instead of criticizing the lack of professionalism, he reached out and traced the line of it with his thumb, smearing it slightly, making a mess. "I spent my whole life trying to hide the tremors," Nathaniel whispered. "I thought if I varnished over them enough times, no one would know I was shaking." Abigail leaned into his touch. "And now?" she asked. "Now I know that the tremor is the only part that's real," he replied. The perfection was just a cage. He dropped his hand to her waist, pulling her closer. They stood there, surrounded by broken things they were slowly putting back together. They had lost the prestige. They had lost the fortune. They lived in a small apartment above the shop, worrying about rent and the price of solvents, but they had gained the one thing the museum could never house: life. Nathaniel looked around the modest studio. It was a far cry from the grand gallery. There were no velvet ropes here, no security guards, just the art, breathing in the same air as they were. "Do you miss it?" Abigail asked quietly, a question she had been afraid to voice for months. "The power? The legacy?" Nathaniel looked at the street outside, where people walked by, glancing in the window, seeing two people working, not a monument to be feared. "I miss the Vienna portrait," he admitted with a faint smile. "But I don't miss the glass." He turned fully to her, his expression turning serious. "I realized something, Abigail. All those years, walking those halls, I was jealous of the paintings." Abigail blinked. "Jealous?" "They were allowed to be seen," Nathaniel said. "They were allowed to be broken and cracked and aged, and people still loved them. I wasn't allowed to be anything but a reflection of my father's name." He kissed her forehead, a soft, lingering seal on his confession. "You broke the glass, Abigail. You were the only one brave enough to touch the canvas and tell me it was okay to be human. We protect the masterpiece behind glass, forgetting that art was meant to be felt, not just seen." The leitmotif returned to them, no longer a warning, but a benediction. They had stopped protecting their lives from the messiness of the world and had started living them. They understood now that love wasn't about preservation, it was about restoration. It was about finding the cracks and filling them with gold, not to hide them, but to honor the history of the break. Abigail took his hand, the hand of a former director, now the hand of an artisan, and kissed his knuckles. "We have a lot of work to do," she smiled, gesturing to the room full of damaged art. "We have a lifetime," Nathaniel corrected. He turned back to the easel. He watched Abigail walk back to her station, the sunlight catching the dust motes dancing around her, the same chaotic, beautiful dust he had once forbidden. He realized that the greatest work of art he would ever care for wasn't hanging on a wall. It was the woman who sat in the light, humming a soft melody that filled the empty spaces of his heart. He picked up his brush, dipped it in the varnish, and began to work, finally understanding that true mastery isn't about control. It's about knowing when to let go. He had spent 30 years building a fortress to keep the world out, never suspecting that the only way to save his legacy was to let a girl with paint on her hands tear the walls down.